Today, we're going to completely shatter a lie, one that most of us have probably believed since, middle school? It's this persistent illusion that easy, comfortable studying somehow equals effective learning. Well, we're diving deep into the cognitive science behind how our brains actually retain information. So if you've ever felt totally frustrated because your study efforts just aren't paying off, you are in exactly the right place. Okay, let's just get right into it and talk about a totally universal frustration. You know the feeling, right? Why does staring at perfectly color-coded notes, highlighting literally every other sentence for 6 straight hours, somehow results in a dismal 42% on a mock exam? I mean, it's a scenario that plagues learners absolutely everywhere, from kids in middle school all the way to adults grinding for professional certifications. You put in the time, you feel immensely productive, but the results? They just aren't there. To really understand this, we need to look at what researchers call calibration accuracy. You can think of calibration accuracy kind of like an internal scale. It's the scale we use to judge our own level of understanding. Now, when our calibration is spot on, our confidence perfectly matches our actual competence. But when it's off, we suffer from this massive gap between what we think we know and what we actually know. And that, unfortunately, leads us to make some pretty terrible decisions about what and how to study. Cognitive psychologists Elizabeth and Robert Bjork discovered something totally fascinating about this gap. It turns out passive studying actually creates an illusion of familiarity. When you just sit there and reread a chapter, the text becomes visually familiar, right? This perceptual fluency actually tricks your brain into a false sense of mastery. Basically, you mistake your ability to recognize the words on the page for the ability to actually recall and explain those concepts from memory when you're sitting in the exam. So the absolutely crucial point here is that we have to distinguish between short-term performance and actual genuine learning. Think of performance like building a wobbly tower of blocks. It looks super impressive in the moment during your study session, like when you successfully answer a question right after reading the paragraph, but it easily falls apart. True learning, on the other hand, is more like a deeply rooted tree. It represents a permanent, stable change in your knowledge that actually supports long-term retention. Because honestly, short-term performance during practice is a highly unreliable index of true learning. And the reason our brains fool us so easily is because we operate with two entirely distinct metrics. Think of retrieval strength, like a flash of lightning. It's highly accessible, it's flashy right now, mostly because you just looked at the textbook 5 seconds ago, but it's fleeting. This makes the topic feel incredibly easy in the moment, which completely masks a severe lack of underlying storage strength. And storage strength, that's the deep, secure filing cabinet where those entrenched and connected memories actually live. This whole metacognitive failure ties directly into a pretty famous psychological concept you've probably heard of, the Dunning-Kruger effect. Basically, because struggling learners lack the actual domain knowledge required to evaluate themselves, they just don't recognize their own incompetence. They naturally overestimate their abilities, leading to that poor calibration we talked about. And this explains exactly why struggling learners don't even realize they need to change up their study habits in the first place. What's really interesting is how this calibration error shows up across different types of students. Low performers tend to overestimate their readiness because they confuse that visual familiarity with true mastery. They literally just don't know what they don't know. Meanwhile, high-performing or gifted students often fall into the exact opposite trap. They mistakenly assume that because they grasp a concept quickly, well, it must be easy for everyone. So they actually underestimate their relative performance. But make no mistake, both of these are massive failures of metacognitive monitoring. So, how on earth do we break out of this illusion? Well, we have to introduce what cognitive scientists call desirable difficulties. And I absolutely love this concept. It basically means making things hard on yourself, but in a really good way. These are science-backed obstacles that trigger deep neural encoding. And here's the paradox. Introducing these difficulties actually slows down your rate of apparent, immediate learning, but it aggressively secures your long-term retention. It's a total game changer. Let's look at 4 primary desirable difficulties that you can start using literally today. First up is varying your study conditions, something as simple as changing the physical room you study in. Second is interleaving, which just means mixing up different topics rather than studying them in big monolithic blocks. Third, spacing your study sessions out over time rather than pulling an all-nighter to cram. And fourth, utilizing testing as an actual study event, not just as a terrifying assessment at the very end. Now, if you're sitting there doubting whether making things harder actually works, the data is absolutely staggering. Just listen to these numbers from a study by researchers Rower and Taylor. They had students learn math formulas. The group that used interleaving, mixing up the types of problems, they retained an incredible 63% of the material a week later. The group that used traditional blocked practice, doing all the exact same type of problems at once, they retained only 20%. 63 versus 20? That's huge. But here is the catch. Learners consistently misjudge what actually works. When you look at the data on how students felt, the vast majority confidently predicted that the comfortable blocked practice helped them learn better. But the actual performance data proves the exact opposite. They falsely believed the easy method was working, completely blind to the fact that the difficult, interleaved method was the one actually building genuine mastery. Our brains are so sneaky. Which brings us to the absolute ultimate tool for true mastery, active recall. This is the process of deliberately challenging your mind to retrieve information from memory without looking at your notes. And hey, this isn't just some generic study tip. This is hardcore neuroscience. By forcing your brain to act as an active architect of information rather than just a passive consumer, you actively trigger neuroplasticity. You're physically forging stronger, thicker neural pathways. The good news is you can easily implement active recall through a bunch of highly effective methods. Flashcards are a classic, obviously, but you can also use self-quizzing, where you just close the book and try to summarize the key points. You could try explaining concepts out loud to an imaginary audience or your dog. Or, here's a real pro tip, and honestly my personal favorite, blurting. This is where you take a completely blank piece of paper and write down absolutely everything you can possibly remember about a topic before you even peek at your notes. Now, to actively fix that broken metacognitive monitoring we talked about earlier, you should try running what's called a prediction post-diction cycle. Here's how you do it. Before a quiz or a study session, explicitly write down a prediction of your score. Just guess it. Then, take the assessment. Afterward, compare your actual score to your prediction. Doing this repeatedly forces you to notice your own patterns, whether you lean towards overconfidence or underconfidence, and it dynamically recalibrates your self-awareness. Another incredibly powerful technique is using delayed judgments of learning. And this is simpler than it sounds. It basically just means you wait at least 24 hours after studying a topic before you rate your confidence in it. Think about it. If you rate your understanding immediately after reading, your brain is just feeling that short-term perceptual familiarity. Waiting a day, that forces you to assess your actual long-term storage strength, totally preventing your brain from tricking you. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, from the sneaky traps of passive learning all the way to the incredible power of cognitive science. So, now that you know exactly how your brain's natural preference for comfort actually sabotages your long-term success, I want to leave you with this question. What desirable difficulty are you going to add to your learning today? Seriously, embrace the struggle, because that is where the real learning actually happens.